We want to go back in and look to see what's going on with homework as far as what did we do this week. I have a lot of brand new students, which is pretty amazing to me in my morning group. We have some of them had come for part 1 of Daniel, and then we took such a long 10-month break that now they're back into it again, and they practically like coming in as a brand new student. So with more than half or more of my morning group being brand new students, I feel like I need to make sure that everyone is understanding the method that we're going through and the steps that we're going through. Every study that you do, you learn a different kind of tool in your toolbox of through doing your inductive study. Inductive study, each study is tailored to the literary style that you're working in, right? So if you're working in a book like Timothy or Romans, you know, one of the letters or some of the doctrinal things, those are handled differently. But in a book like Prophecy, you've got some unique things that you have to you know, come up with ways of looking at it in order to come to sound interpretation, because you can't just make a simple list and say, oh, that's what it means, because it's not going to make sense to you when you're talking about something like what we looked at in Daniel 2, which was a statue. And what did you see with the statue? A head and shoulder and thighs and legs and feet. And you're like, okay, that's the list, but now what does that mean? And so you cannot use the same tools for visions or prophetic utterances or visions, which is what we're dealing with in Daniel, as you can with what you would do if you were handling just a letter, for instance, where it's factual, or a historical document like the book of Acts, where you're just doing, this is historical record, these are the facts, these are the people, the places, the events, but everything is clearly stated. There is no hidden message in the things that are given. So for that reason, Daniel is handled differently. So what we want to do right now is go back and review who our author is. And our author is who? Daniel. Yay. That you are the only one, so you're gonna have to answer until the rest of our group comes. And now our major subjects in the book of Daniel, there's quite a few actually quite a few subjects that are going on in here. But when you consider the biggest picture of it, what is the major emphasis of Daniel? Okay, that God is sovereign. So God is God Most High. That's the title. The title that's used is God Most High. And since that's the most repeated title that's given to us concerning God, that title tells us the quality or the characteristic about God that he really wants to emphasize in this particular writing. So God Most High, by definition, is what? Do you remember what we concluded the characteristic of God Most High? What that was? You actually already said it. Sovereignty, yeah. God Most High, by definition, is speaking to his sovereignty, that he is the authority. Do you remember what the key verse was for the book? Or there were a couple of them that could be chosen, but do you have your at-a-glance chart handy? Okay, on your at-a-glance chart, you should have a place on there that says key verse for the book. It should be down in right in one of these places.
4:17.
Well, it
or
should
2:21.
I'm surprised it's not. Literary
4:17.
style, the author. Okay, so, all right, let me just direct you then. Go to chapter 2, look in verses, I think it's 20 or 21, and let's read that together. Right, read chapter 2, 21 and 22.
It is he who changes the times and the epochs, he who establishes kings, he gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. He who reveals the profound and hidden things, he knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him.
Okay, so there's actually two strong characteristics in that particular verse that are displayed for us about who our God is. One is that he is what? Okay, so he's sovereign. And the other one is what? He reveals things because he knows. And by the fact that he knows, what is that characteristic? God is omniscient. Very good. So he's sovereign and he's all-knowing. And by those two qualities and those two things, which are going to be repeated over and over throughout the book, are they not? Do you remember in chapter 1, in chapter 2, in chapter 3, as we were progressing through those first 6 chapters, if you just kind of in your mind go back and recall some of the storylines, what we kept seeing about God was that, for instance, in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, yes? And what does Daniel do? The king is going to kill everybody. Remember that? Okay, so then what does Daniel do? There you go. He goes to God and says, God, you know, we need an answer to this because our lives are in jeopardy here. And God reveals it to him. And then he goes back to Nebuchadnezzar. And what does he say? Let me tell you what God, it's not something within me, King. I don't know these things, but let me tell you what the God Most High, the God who knows all these things, the one who knows what's hidden, what's the profound things. Let me tell you what he says, and then he gives him an interpretation of that dream. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at tonight is chapter 2's dream. What was the dream? And then what Daniel gave him as interpretation. And we're just going to lay that out as our very first foundation, because one of the things you want to do when you are studying, well, any book of the Bible for that matter, but in particular, a book like this of prophecy, if you want to try to come up with a good understanding of what it is that you're looking at and come to understand the meaning of it more thoroughly, right? Even better than just what Daniel tells us in chapter 2 alone, would be to continue to look in the book, within the book itself, by the same author who has the same historical setting and background, has the same exact purpose for his writing, which we have now looked at Daniel 2:21 and 22 and said what he's doing is he's showing us that God is sovereign and that God is omniscient, right? And if those are the two strong things that God is trying to teach us, the major subject is that God is omniscient, that God is sovereign. So let's write that up there. God is sovereign, and he's all-knowing. And then what are some of the key words, by the way, in the book? Visions, dreams. There you go, kings and kingdoms. And basically, those are the big ones. And there are others, but those are the most important ones. Kings and kingdoms, visions and dreams, and then their interpretation, right? So those being the focus of this author, when we look at chapter 2 and we see the first vision, if we want to understand it better, maybe, yes, he gives us interpretation in chapter 2, which we're going to note, but then what you want to do is you want to say, well, how much more can I learn about that? What else does he really mean on that? And what Inductive Bible Study teaches you is that when you want to get good understanding of a term, of a subject even, is that you would want to compare like material with like material. How many times have I said compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges, but don't compare apples to oranges, right? Don't go from a book of prophecy and then go into a doctrinal and try to make a comparison, because that's not always going to work for you. It might to some degree on some issues, but often it won't give you anything, right? If you want to get interpretation of what's going on in Daniel, one of the best places to look is in Daniel. So that's why Kay, on day 5 of this week's homework, she said to you, go back and look at chapter 2 and chapter 7, those two visions, and make a comparison. So what we want to first establish is, what is the distinction between chapter 2 and chapter 7? So let's go back and talk about, first of all, the kingdoms that it was spoken of in. In chapter 1, what was the kingdom? Who was in charge at that point? Nebuchadnezzar. So we're talking Babylon, right? So we have Babylon in chapter 1. What about chapter 2? Babylon. Chapter 3? Babylon. Chapter 4? Babylon. Chapter 5? Most of 5, all the way through verse 30. We're still in Babylon.
Looks okay? Mm-hmm. I'm going to make the screen up.
Now, chapter 5, verse 31, all the way through chapter 6, we are in what kingdom?
This one.
Medo-Persian.
It's better?
Medo-Persia. We're going to come to see the full name on that later. And then when we get now to chapter 7, which was this week's homework, where are we? We're back in Babylon. As a matter of fact, go back and read chapter 7, verse 1 for me.
The first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it.
Okay, go back to now chapter 1, verse 1, where we started in Babylon, and tell me what you see there and how does it.
In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and
Here's
besieged
7.
Very good. So in chapter 1, you see that the king is who? Who's the king of Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 7, who's the king of Babylon? Belshazzar. So obviously, although we're within the same kingdom from chapter 1 to chapter 7, there is a switch in who these kings are. So one of the things that Kay had us do on your day 2 and 3 was to look at your timeline chart. Do you remember the timeline that we all looked at? Yours should look somewhat similar to this, right? It may not be totally the same, but it's right. And I like to color code mine. You did too. Good for you. Yeah, because it helps me just visualize it. But one of the things she asked us to do is go back and look at different parts on the timelines here. Like for instance, she said, look at the sieges, right? And when did those start and when did they end? And who was taken captive in the first siege? Well, it says right here in this little block right here, it says 3 sieges of captivity. Who was in the first siege on that? Daniel and his 3 friends, right? And then it goes on down the line. So what is the timeline of their captivity? When they go into captivity, what is the year? 605 BC, exactly. Now, looking at Nebuchadnezzar, when does he begin to rule over Babylon? 605. Very interesting that those coincide together. So it looks to me like Nebuchadnezzar sort of made his name by seizing Jerusalem, and it's at that point then his father turns over the kingdom ruling to his son. And there is history behind that. We didn't do a whole lot of look into that in this particular refresher that we did here in part 2, but back in part 1 we did do some reading on that, but it wasn't the emphasis of our information. We simply know that he had a father, and his father ruled for about 21 years according to this timeline that's given to us here, and that Nebuchadnezzar took power in 605 at the same time that Daniel is taken captivity. That's why Daniel and his friends, when they're taken captive, what happens to them? They're taken back to Babylon, and they're taken to be trained to come into service for the king. So what we now know is, if we were to do this on a timeline down here, we know that we start in chapter 2 then, when this vision comes to Nebuchadnezzar, we are still in his first year of reign. Is that correct? Would chapter 2, does it tell us? Second year. So we are at 604, right? So it's 604 BC, and it's Nebuchadnezzar is the king, correct? Now, when we get to chapter 7, we said it's who? Belshazzar. And do we have on that timeline of when, what is the date on there for Belshazzar? 553 BC. So how much time has passed? Well, just a general rule of about 50 years between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. So the dream that was given in chapter 2 to who? Nebuchadnezzar. And then about 50 years later, a dream is given to who? No, it's at the time of his son Belshazzar, but who's chapter 7's dream given to? To Daniel. So this is really quite interesting when you just look at this on the timeline and actually in your mind just note these things. And this is part of the inductive process of just historically laying it out in your mind, what's happened, in what order, what's transpired at this point, how long has it been? I mean, you got to think about Daniel. He's now at least well, he's over 50 years older than he was at the beginning of this. He started here in 605 BC when he went into his captivity. And what does the chart tell us about his age? He was about how old? Do you remember? Yeah. 15, 16, 17, somewhere there. I mean, they debate about it, but about 15 to 17 years of age. So 50 years later, he's now how old? 60 something. He's my age, right? So now he's an old man, old like me. And now he's having his vision down here. So that helps you just kind of, first of all, it helps you to realize how much water has gone under the bridge in Daniel's life. He has served Nebuchadnezzar all these years, and now he's under Belshazzar. And what we looked at when we read chapter 6 about Belshazzar, what did Belshazzar know about Daniel when he came to the throne and he saw the handwriting on the wall?
Well, he didn't know anything about it.
He really knew very little. Or he did know, but he had sort of dismissed him, right? Because one of the things I remember it saying in chapter 6, you knew all these things, right? Because the mother, the queen mother, or whoever she was, the queen comes in and has this discussion with Belshazzar and says, there is a man in the kingdom who can give you understanding of the writing on the wall. And he says, there was a man named Daniel who was among the sons of Judah, who was brought captive by your father Nebuchadnezzar. And we now know this is actually his grandfather, probably, right? Or father-in-law through marriage. But he's not his actual father. But there's been 50 years passing, and he knew about Daniel, but apparently had simply dismissed him, because when he needed interpretation, who did he call on? No, before he turned to the Chaldeans, to the soothsayers, all the magicians of the land at that time, right? And so then when the queen comes in and says, you know, there's this man who does have interpretation, who knows visions and dreams, in whose God there's a spirit about him that he can interpret these things, and she says to him, and you knew all these things. Let's go back and read that, because I thought that was pretty profound. Yeah, let's see. I've got to open my observation worksheet here. Wrong one. It's in chapter 5. Oh, I'm sorry. I got the wrong chapter. Chapter 5. Okay. Okay. Okay, verse 22 is the verse where she has this conversation going on, dialoguing with him. And he says, because in verse 19, because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, and all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. So she goes on to tell the story about Nebuchadnezzar and how Nebuchadnezzar eventually bows his knee to God Most High, right? Which we saw in the previous chapters. This is Daniel answering. That's exactly right. Daniel is answering. And then he goes on and talks about how Nebuchadnezzar was humbled, which is pretty cool story, right? That whole event was very cool. And he says, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken away from him. I want you to hear those words. He was deposed, he was taken off that throne. His glory was deposed from him, right? And he was driven away from mankind. His heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle. There's a mental illness called bovine something, and it is actually a mental state that it's a diagnosis. It is an actual literal diagnosis. And he says he began to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until what happened? There you go. Until he recognized. Now, what's very interesting is before in, was it chapter 5 where he was? No, it's chapter 4. In chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar is humbled by God, God told him 7 periods of time are going to pass over you until you will finally recognize me as God Most High. And when you do that, I will restore you. So here we see him, Daniel, now reflecting this storyline back to him. And he's saying, And he says, until you recognize that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind and that he sets over it whomever he wishes, yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Now, so this tells us that Belshazzar did know about Nebuchadnezzar and the dreams and the visions. He knew about this dream that he had had also concerning the statue. He had known about the tree vision that that Nebuchadnezzar had had, and that Daniel also gave the king warning, and that he would go into become like a beast or an animal for all these years. And he did. And he says, but you have exalted yourself against the God of heaven, or against the Lord of heaven. Now, we talked last week in our other classes, and I know you weren't here, so I want to go back and kind of address it. How we see God dealing differently with Nebuchadnezzar versus Belshazzar. Remember with Nebuchadnezzar, how many times did God, through his servants like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how many times did God keep showing him who he was, his power, his sovereignty, his ability? One of the things that the three men, when they were about to be cast in the fire, was, our God is able to save. But even if he doesn't, what? That's right. We still will not worship you. So what we see then with Nebuchadnezzar, as he's looking at these three men in the fire, and then a fourth man appears, and yet he still resists it, right? And then the next chapter, we see him then have the tree vision, right? And yet he still resists. And Daniel says, look, I wish this dream weren't about you, king. Wish it were about your enemies. But if you'll just repent, right, maybe God will not bring this upon you. But what does Nebuchadnezzar do?
After a while, he's walking around on top. He's like, look at all I
Yeah.
did. Look at me.
As a matter of fact, a whole year had passed. Think about that. So God has shown himself to Nebuchadnezzar over and over and over and over, right? And then he finally says, look, I'm going to humble you. I'm going to do this to you, and then you're going to recognize me. And so how does God know that he's going to recognize him? How does God know that after 7 periods of time, that then finally Nebuchadnezzar will lift his eyes? That's right. Because again, because he's an all-knowing God. So in God's sovereignty, he puts into motion life occurrences that, because he knows Nebuchadnezzar's heart, and remember, we didn't look at it in our homework time, but think about Hebrews, where it talks about God, he examines the heart, right? And his word is like a two-edged sword. It can divide between what is it, marrow and yeah, yes, and it can discern even the intents of the heart. And so God is a God who examines the heart, and he examined the heart of Nebuchadnezzar, and apparently he came to see and was knowing, because he is all knowing, that he would humble his heart. And so God continues to pursue him, right? And in the end, what happens? Nebuchadnezzar lifts his eyes to heaven. He proclaims God as God Most High. And apparently, from the text, he is saved. There's salvation for Nebuchadnezzar. But now compare that. Do a contrast review in your head about Belshazzar. What happens with Belshazzar? He has a big party.
Yes, the party takes all the stuff out of the temple. And
right?
Drinking and
having a part and toasting to the other gods with the vessels that are intended for God's glory. Okay. And when this is all over, there's handwriting on the wall, right? Let's read it. What was the handwriting on the wall? What did it say? Yeah, well, let's see if I can find. Okay, now we're in chapter 5, verses 25 to 28, right? Okay, read that for us.
Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, uparsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. And Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians.
Okay, so how does that differ from how he handled Nebuchadnezzar. No, he.
Second chance at all.
And what does it say is the reason? Does it give us any kind of hint in there as to why God doesn't continue to pursue? Even though he did know, because we just read that Belshazzar did know about these events concerning his grandfather or his father-in-law, whatever the relationship, says his father. So he knew all about Nebuchadnezzar and how God humbled him. And yet in this inscription, the interpretation that we just read, it says of him what? God has numbered your kingdom, put it to an end. Why?
You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient.
There you go. God has weighed his heart. Does that not sound just like the Hebrews, that God pierces the heart? He divides between bone and marrow. He knows the heart and the intent of the heart. And so here we have a proclamation that the all-knowing sovereign God of this writing is showing us he examined the hearts of both Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. With Nebuchadnezzar, he saw a man who could be humbled. So what does God keep doing with him? Pursuing. But when he looked at the heart of Belshazzar, what did he see?
It's not much.
I have looked at your heart. I have weighed it in the balance, and I have found it deficient, it says, or wanting is another phrase that is sometimes used. So in this case, what you see is how God deals differently with different people because he knows the end from the beginning. And it's not because God determines it for the person, but that he is able to see the end from the beginning, and he knows the heart of the individual. It kind of reminds me of the storyline of Joseph, or not Joseph, of Pharaoh, when it says that God hardens his heart, right? But why does he harden his heart? What had Pharaoh done? He had hardened his own heart over and over. Hi, come on in, have a chair. So we have the exact picture, I think, in this book of showing us two. Y'all can come up. Yeah, just move in closer wherever you want to be. That helps you out. That might be a good spot for you right there where there's not light on you if you don't like the light. Okay, super. Anyway, so what God shows us, I think, through these two records of salvation for one and judgment of the other is that God is an all-knowing God that's sovereign over the affairs of man, and in the life of one man he keeps pursuing and pursuing until finally the man, his heart is humbled and he lifts his eyes to heaven. But with the other, we see him examining his heart, finding it deficient, and saying this very night, and so what happened, verse 31 of chapter 5? Yeah, and in verse 30, yeah, it says that very same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So God found him deficient because he had examined his heart and found it deficient. So it isn't that God made an arbitrary choice for one or the other, but that he has examined the heart of both men. And he came to understand that one was a man who could be humbled, the other was a man who would not be humbled. And so he dealt with each one accordingly. And that, again, reveals to us the God Most High of Daniel, who is all-knowing and sovereign. So you get to see the balance of it in the display of the storylines here. Okay, so that gives us a good backdrop to what we're looking at as far as that goes. And so then when we see this timeline, this helps us also to see where we are in the timeline of events and all the things that have transpired through the work of Daniel and through the life of Daniel under the kingdom of Babylon. And we know that Daniel goes all the way to the very end, and he actually enters into at least the first years of Darius, because then it says in the next chapter 6, who comes into the kingdom? In chapter 6? Darius. And Darius begins to do what in verse 1? Yes. He's appointing all these different people to help him rule in his kingdom. So he's establishing his kingdom and his rule and his authority in that kingdom. And who is in the storyline of that is Daniel. So we see Daniel now, who had been dismissed by Belshazzar and considered insignificant, who is now raised back up again through divine providence, through God's, obviously God's divine work, and also through the fact that he's faithful to God through all of this. And so through the ups, I would say, because he's up when he's with the King Nebuchadnezzar, and then in the downs through Belshazzar, Daniel remains faithful through all of it. Now comes in another king, Darius, and a new kingdom, the Medes and the Persians, and Daniel is once again raised up. Again, our sovereign God, who's all-knowing, gets displayed. Okay, so in the homework that we did then, we went back, we marked time references in each of those chapters. We were supposed to have recorded the main event of each chapter of Daniel on your at-a-glance chart, which hopefully you all did that. Let me see if mine is handy here. See if I can pull it out. It's always tough when you put it away. See, this is the danger of being organized, because when you put stuff away, then you can't find it again. Your at-a-glance chart is, do you have yours handy? Okay, good. I can't find my at-a-glance chart. What did I do with it? Back here. Here it is. See, I put it away. Okay. So week one's homework, or this week two's homework, it's actually technically week one, because it's Daniel part 2, your lesson 1, which is where we're at now. Your job was to go back over your at-a-glance chart, refresh your memory on everything, which we mostly did last week in our introductory class 0. But that was your homework to do now. And it should have been pretty easy because of that lesson that we did last week together. But you want to make sure that your at-a-glance chart is filled out, that your titles are on there, that you're noting things such as this. Which kingdom is around? Where are we? So that now what we see in this timeline, by putting it this way, rather than sequentially in a chapter, but if you put it on a timeline, what we're seeing now is we had a little, like a little hiccup in there in chapter 6, where the Medo-Persia came into the scene, but now in 7, we went back to Babylon. So we see the first vision in chapter 2 was under Nebuchadnezzar. The time frame is approximately 604 BC when this dream occurs. And now what we're looking at for today's homework, or this week's homework in chapter 7, it was still under the Babylonian captivity, but it was under Belshazzar. And according to your timeline right here, if you looked on here, Belshazzar began at 553 BC. So we've passed about 50 years. That's a quick review for the two of you all. That's what we've covered so far. We've done a lot of stuff, but most of it you were here last week for, so you really haven't missed anything. Okay, for those who are Zooming with us now, they got pretty much a little bit of a review of what we did last week. Okay, so that's good. So make sure you've got your at-a-glance chart caught up and up to date. If you don't, do that, because that's super important. These at-a-glance charts are one of the most important tools you can develop for yourself and hang on to, because they are going to be the thing that you keep referring back to. Every time we do anything, we go back to our at-a-glance chart, and you're just going to keep building on that. So make sure that's handy and done. And your timeline, I like to color code mine. I don't know if you all did that or not when you marked your timeline that was given to you, this chart, Daniel's timeline. But I like to kind of color code it, because that helps me see the difference between the two kingdoms. And the Greece kingdom that's going to follow the Medo-Persian isn't even on this timeline here at all. It's not even addressed, but we will be getting into it, won't we, when we move further on into Daniel, into the next dreams and visions that are going to be coming. So hang on to those. Those are important to cover. So we did that. Time references, at-a-glance chart, identifying the literary style, which we know is what? Our literary style for this book? That's right, prophecy and history. And why is it important to identify the type of literary style we're working with? There you go. It's all about interpretation, because you're going to use different interpretation tools and methods for a literal book, like a book of history or a letter, right? Than you will for a book like what we're in, which is history and prophecy. Prophecy in particular is tricky, because how do we get the prophecy in this book? Is through visions. And visions is all imagery, and imagery has to be interpreted, right? Okay, so it's important to make that note. So this week's homework you did on day 2 and 3 was to go through Daniel chapter 7. Again, mark your key words. What kind of key words did you mark in Daniel 7? Good.
Dreams and
Good.
visions.
You know what? You're almost always absolutely going to get a star if you say God. Really good. He knows how to schmooze the teacher, doesn't he?
Kingdom and dominions.
Very good. So she gave you that. She gave you the list. You know, that's the thing about Precept. It's funny. It's like you're supposed to find them yourself, but then she'll give you the list at some point. If you just wait long enough, she'll tell you, which is always pretty funny. Although often I found that I mark keywords that she doesn't even list, and sometimes they turn out to be important, and sometimes they really don't, you know. But like in chapter 1, the distinction between sons of Israel and sons of Judah. Remember, we talked about that last week. The distinction, do you recall, Kristen, when we talked about that in part 1? In chapter 1 of Daniel, it begins to saying about the sons of Israel, and among the sons of Israel were some sons of Judah, who were Daniel and his 3 friends. Do you remember what the definition of Judah is? If you do a word study on Judah, it's to throw
Lion.
praise. And who do you throw praise to? God Most High. So in the case of Daniel and his 3 friends, the distinction is made that they were different than some of those sons of Israel, who also were taken captive with them at the same time. But Daniel and his friends were those who threw praise to God. And so what you see in the storyline of chapter 1 right away is Daniel and the 3 friends are like cream. They start to float to the top, right? They excel among even their fellow Hebrew brothers, and they're called the sons of Judah. So that's one of those times where I can say to you that I picked out a key word and marked it, and then did a word study on it, and found it really was significant. Although we didn't talk about it in homework and it wasn't a part of the lesson, it did turn out to reveal something to me that I thought was unique and insightful. And to me, it kind of made a profound statement about how that made them distinct. And I wondered when I read it, why would they call them sons of Israel in one, and then refer among the sons of Israel, there's these sons of Judah. And I'm like, what was the distinction? Because all the ones taken in that captivity were sons of Judah. They were all from the same place. So it turned out to be an interesting word. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, right. Do not go over. That's exactly right. Because, and she did tell us, I think we're going to spend 3 weeks on chapter 7. So we're spending a lot of time on it. What does that tell you then about chapter 7? If we're going to spend 3 weeks in it, well, okay, maybe it's going to be very hard. That's very important. But it's very important. There you go, Kristen. That's really the key. The key is that chapter 7 must be very important. It's important enough that she wants to make sure you actually really get all the most important parts about chapter 7, because apparently it's going to be built upon in the chapters that will follow. And I can tell you for a fact, what we're going to look at tonight in chapter 2 and 7 are foundational to understanding Revelation when we move into Revelation. If you don't get these down first, you miss enough of the storyline that you are not going to totally comprehend everything when you get into Revelation. A lot of our interpretations in Revelation are given to us by the qualities and the characteristics that we learn in chapter 2 and 7. Okay? It's going to be so fun, though, because we begin to build our knowledge about the characters on the stage of the play that plays out for us in Revelation when we move into it. It's going to be, again, do you remember how this week, one of the things you were asked to do is do a storyboard, right? Draw pictures. I know. Now, okay, you did good on the right. Okay, now I'm gonna try to say this really nicely, but you really have to do those pictures. Here's why. Because if you don't do the drawings, there are things that you will miss. There are insights that you will read past. It's just human nature. We all do it. We look past something and go, oh, I missed that. Oh, I didn't understand that's what they meant. And you don't always get it until you're in the middle of the drawing of it, right? The other thing is this, when you move into Revelation, part 2 of Revelation, we spend 4 weeks drawing out the entire book of Revelation. The whole thing is drawing. That tells you how important it is. Now, why do you think that's so important? What is our literary form? Prophecy. What is prophecy? Images and visions. And you need to get those down in your head and get them visualized on paper for yourself so that you pay attention to each piece. Do you think every point that's made in the vision is an important point? Like when it's talking about the statue and it says the head is this, the arms are this, right? And it gets all the way down to the feet, right? And in the vision in chapter 7, when you get into the feet, it talks about toes, not just feet, toes. And how many toes are there? 10, right? So every piece of imagery is important. And this is why visualizing it in story. Now, I understand people don't like to draw. But you know what was really cool is by the time we were done talking about it, and we did the whole lesson together, and we started sharing our drawings together, those of us who did do it, the rest of the people said, okay, I'm going home and drawing now, because I can see how this is going to be important. If you don't draw it now, when you go into Revelation, you're going to miss it there too. And you are building, this is the starting point of your understanding of eschatology. Understanding the whole picture requires you slow down and get the imagery of each piece of the vision that is reflected to you through the writing, but it's given to you in an oral form, in a written form. You have to get it visualized for yourself so that you don't miss all the pieces. Your pictures do not have to be great. And I can show you my little pictures. Now, I've drawn these over and over and over. I even one time, where's my other one? Right here. Okay, so you can see, I'll go up closer. These are my very silly little pictures. My beast, my dreadful, terrifying beast, he kind of looks cute and cuddly. I want to give him a hug. It looks like a blue teddy bear or something. And I did give him ferocious teeth and gave him a frown, so he looked mean. But, you know, it doesn't matter that it's not a perfect drawing. And you don't have to be a great artist. Now, I did this kind of a drawing of 2 or 3 times. I've done a Revelation. I think this is either my 4th or 5th time through it. I did it once as a student, and I've taught it, I think 3 times at this church, and 1 time when I was in Virginia. So this is my 4th time to teach it. Every time I draw these, I find something new that I missed the first time. Last time we did this, I did it this way with clip art. I took clip art and put it together and did a storyboard. I can tell you though, now having done that, the clip art was not as revealing to me as doing my own drawing. Even though my own drawing is silly and not great, and a lot of it is stick figures, you're going to see in a lot of these, I just do triangles. I gave them faces. Sometimes they're little stick people. All they have is a head and a stick body, but it conveys to me what's going on in each portion of this. And so each of my boxes, this is verse 2, this is verse 3, this is verse 4, this is verse 5. So I did verse by verse as it gave me a new scenario of what was going on. I did a picture of it in each one. So I've got every verse done in here so that I can look at this and I know what's going on. That's in the first 14 verses. Then in the interpretation, which is 19 to 27, I went through and did those as well. Okay. But you're going to find that if you don't do these, you're hurting yourself, because later you're going to have to do it when we do Revelation as well. This is going to be immensely helpful to you when you move into the next one, because you're going to have already figured out a lot by having done this. And if you don't do this, you're just delaying the pain. You're going to have to do it anyway. Okay. And I can tell you again, as I try to instruct concerning what is inductive Bible study about, it's about giving you tools that help you to come to sound interpretation. Sound interpretation is not by running to a commentary and seeing what someone else says about it. That's what we're all used to doing in the old days, right? Me too. I used to run to commentaries, but you know what I have come to find out about a lot of commentaries that I read now? They're not that good. A lot of times they're wrong. Now, sometimes they're right, obviously. There's some good commentaries out there. But I have also found that very often they miss really big pieces. They just skip over it or skip past it, or they put in their own denominational persuasions on things, on how they're trying to present an answer, but they're not factual and they don't back it up. They don't give you a cross-reference or a validation to what they're saying is their conclusion, or they don't even explain their conclusion. Sometimes they just give you a conclusion and then they don't explain how they came to that conclusion. I'm like, well, how do you know that? Well, if you do the homework yourself in inductive Bible study through this process, you've done the research yourself. You've looked at the verse, you've listed your keywords, you've made a list on them. Like one of the things she asked us to do this time is God and Daniel, again, begin to make a list. Do you remember last week what we did with those lists? Remember how we talked about, what did we learn about God? What did we learn about Daniel? Wasn't that really profound in a lot of ways about learning the character of a man named Daniel and him living under a time frame in history where there was a lot of persecution? I mean, he was in captivity because of his nation and their sin, but he was an innocent man. As an innocent man who had been living righteously and trying to honor God as a young man, he's now in captivity for what his nation has done wrong. How does that relate to us today? Are we not seeing very similar things right now? We're under duress from our nation now, simply because we are Christian and they don't like us. And we're going to find that the further down the time comes, closer and closer to the end, it's going to get worse and worse for Christians. So we're going to need to learn these qualities that Daniel had of integrity and steadfastness and long suffering and faithfulness and just trusting and believing God and going to God in prayer and banding together with friends of like faith that would help support one another. I mean, all these things that we learned about Daniel are things that we need to know. And even more important was what we learned about who God is, right? Who is God in this book in particular. It's not the totality of God's characteristics or attributes, but in this book, for the message of this book, we've learned about God, that he is sovereign and that he is all-knowing. And those two qualities alone, how are they valuable to you and I to know when we're in a time in history where we're being sought after to be put on a list somewhere? How does knowing that God is sovereign help us when we face this dreaded disease called COVID, right? We know that our God does what concerning life? That's right. He's measured our days. Our days are numbered by God. And do we need to fear death? No. Now, obviously, we need to be careful and not do crazy things. But what the world is doing to us right now is trying to shut us down as a people, not interact with one another, not have relationships with one another. And so if we believe the lies that the world keeps giving to us concerning things like COVID and other things, basically Satan has won, right? He's winning that battle because he has shut us down and closed us up and put us in our homes so fearful that we won't leave. But Daniel has taught us, this book so far, in the first 7 chapters, we've learned that our God is both sovereign and our God is all-knowing. We know that God measures our days. We saw what he did with Belshazzar at the end of his life. He examined his heart, found him wanting, and that very night he lost his life. But yet Nebuchadnezzar, he was 7 years as a brute beast out in the field and over 7 periods of time. And then what happens to him one day? God restores him back to the throne and gives him greater glory than he even had before. Amazing. Job is another example of that. So what we're learning about who God is and who Daniel are in those lists that we're making right now are really important. So don't forget to do those lists, even though they're kind of on the sideline from where I know your heart and focus really are, which is you want to understand these visions and what are the end time events that are coming. You want to understand the eschatology. You want to be able to understand Revelation when we get there, but don't miss out on the joy of discovery about who your God is and who Daniel was as an example to us as well. So that was all in your homework this week, making a list on God, making a list on Daniel, and then the sketching of the storyboard. And then the last day's homework, day 5, you were supposed to do kind of some comparisons. She had us do a chart right here. Remember this chart right here with your statue? And we were to list each of these and then look at the interpretation on it, which we did, right? And then she said, go over to chapter 7 and look at that dream and try to make a comparison. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. And we're going to try to draw as much out of what we saw in our homework together and draw any additional insights as we just discuss it together, okay? So let's start with the first one. Who had the vision in chapter 2? In chapter 2, we're going back to chapter 2 first. Nebuchadnezzar. So open up to chapter 2 or pull out your chart that you've filled in. That will be helpful. But opening to chapter 2, I think will be good for you also. Okay? All right. So the vision is given to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, who is Nebuchadnezzar? It's a simple question. He's the king of Babylon. He's a Gentile, right? In comparison to who the two nations that we're looking at in the book of Daniel on the whole is really basically boils down to Israel and Gentile kingdoms, if you really want to just make a big contrast in general. What we're seeing in the first 6 chapters is information that's given to a Gentile king about the kingdoms of men, right? So he gives him the statue dream, and then he begins to then have Daniel comes in and gives him understanding of what the dream was about, because he doesn't know it, right? Isn't it interesting then that God's using Daniel, who's in his captivity, no fault of his own, but while he's in there, God is using him as an instrument for God's glory and as an instrument to bring others into faith in God Most High. So let's look then at that dream. All right, we said concerning the dream, what is the dream about? It's a statue. And the first part of the statue is a head of gold. And when it came to the interpretation, who gave the interpretation? Daniel gives the interpretation. Oh, I got to write smaller. Okay. So he says about the head of gold what? What does he tell him the head of gold is? Yep, he says, Nebuchadnezzar, you are that head of gold. Now, I love when scripture does that for us. And most of the time in the Bible, you will find that if a vision is given or a dream is given, if you just keep reading far enough, it'll give you the understanding of it. Someone will come up, either one of God's people through God's giving knowledge, like he did to Daniel, giving him understanding. God will give that understanding, or is what we're going to see when we get into chapter 7, when Daniel has the dream. How does he get understanding? Yeah, somebody is standing. Who do you think that somebody is? So it could be. So it's some kind of a spiritual being. It's a supernatural manifestation of some sort that's given to Daniel. So a heavenly being of some sort comes and gives Daniel his understanding. In the case of Nebuchadnezzar, God gives Daniel the understanding so that Daniel goes and speaks to him. Now, why would God do that? Why not God just giving an angel to one of those Chaldean conjurers or magicians and letting them give interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar? There you go. The whole point is not that God just wants Nebuchadnezzar to understand his dream. He wants Nebuchadnezzar to understand who gave the understanding and from whom the knowledge of that understanding comes from. And by using his own people to do that, what it is, it becomes a witness to Nebuchadnezzar about God Most High. So he becomes his witness. Okay, so we got a head of gold. The next thing on the statue is what? Arms and breast of silver. Okay, and what was the interpretation on that? Yes, there's another kingdom and it's inferior to you. And it's very interesting because in chapter 2, verse 39, he also makes sure that he says, after, right? Someone read that verse. After you, King Nebuchadnezzar, after Babylon, there is going to come another kingdom. So he's making it super clear to him that your kingdom basically is what? Going to end. And when it ends, there's going to come another kingdom after you. Now, he does give one descriptive in quality of the second kingdom that follows him. And what does he tell him about it? It's inferior. Did we already get a clue to that in the dream, though? What is one is gold, one is silver. Somehow, silver is inferior to gold. Now, we know that at least by quality, right, of value. I think that silver is actually harder than gold as far as strength, but we know value of it, it's inferior, okay? So he tells us by the interpretation, what is depicted here is the inferiority, that it's less of something, right? Okay, good question. What does that mean then? Inferior in what way? What do we know about the Babylonian kingdom? It was very big. When Nebuchadnezzar built, for instance, Babylon, the city Babylon, and he built, what kinds of things were in that city? Do you remember anything about it? Those beautiful gardens. Now, whether they're true or fictitious is all, debated. But what we do know,
Pathways with all these like just beautiful
right?
colors and bright road.
There you go. When we started, Daniel, I began reading to you all out of a book called The Rise of Babylon. And I read to you about a reporter that went to Babylon for some kind of a ceremony. And he was describing what he was seeing at the time of these huge, beautiful structures, this promenade that went all the way down. All these soldiers are all arrayed in this beautiful armor. They're all standing there like, the soldiers up and down, the people, the procession of things that was coming through. It was just this grandeur to it, right? So when you think back on Babylon and what we understand about Babylon and we compare it to the Medo-Persian Empire, is that Babylon was much more beautiful, much more, it was richer. It was more lavish. And so the idea of gold representing him, and that then silver is somehow inferior. Obviously, it isn't inferior in strength necessarily. However, we do know that it had changed hands, right? We had Babylon, when it came on the scene, it took over a kingdom before it too, right? Do you guys know who the kingdom was before Babylon? Which is not addressed in the book of Daniel. But do you remember who took the northern kingdoms of Israel into their captivity? Assyria. So there was Assyria before Babylon as a world power. And so Assyria had taken their captivity. So then Babylon comes on and takes over Assyria. Now, then we see Medo-Persia come in and take over. So apparently, as the time passes between Nebuchadnezzar in 604 and Belshazzar in 553, there's a distinct difference. For one thing, we almost can see it by the behavior of Belshazzar described to us in that chapter 6, where he's having a party. While who's at his door that very night? His enemy to take him over. He's sleeping on the job as a king, obviously, right? He's having a party and living vivaciously, you know, while.
It's interesting because I hadn't even thought about that. It's not like these men are like riding in trucks that just showed up there real fast.
No.
It's big armies that were coming across the land.
Right. And he had to have heard the rumors that there was a, right. How could he not know? Exactly. So again, when you go back to your question, Sharon, about what does it mean it was inferior if it took it over? Well, I think what happened is, as the time passed between Nebuchadnezzar, who was at the beginning, well, his father was even before him, but with Nebuchadnezzar, by the time we get to Belshazzar, Belshazzar is not only is he dismissive of Daniel, he seems to be dismissive of a lot of things, and he's not really being careful as a king. He's not watching things carefully like he should. So he had let it wane, even though the nation itself, on the whole, throughout most of its time frame on the earth, through its 70 or 80 years or so that it was a kingdom, it was proud, it was beautiful, it was lavish. They had great wealth in that time. And so when the Medes and the Persians came on, though, they just used brute strength and the dismissive attitude of a king who wasn't paying attention, and they took advantage and took control.
Well, and God had said that your days are numbered, so he didn't stop it.
That's a good point.
He didn't
That's
stop
right.
it.
We do know, as a matter of fact, the statue dream tells us, God says, you're that head of gold, but after you is going to come another. You are going to be destroyed, and another kingdom is going to come and take your place. Again, back to the sovereign God who is all-knowing. So after Babylon, he says, comes another. And he's specific, another kingdom, right? He's careful to tell them it's another kingdom, and it is going to be inferior. In some capacity, there's an inferiority to it. Okay, and that's in 239. This one was 238, right? Verse 38. Okay, now our third part of the statue was what? Belly and thighs. And what are they made of? Bronze. Now, if you just consider, again, where we've already been, gold, right? Now silver. Now we're down to bronze. It seems to me like, again, it's digressing, isn't it? And what we see in verse 39, oh yeah, it sure is. I should just get rid of this rug. Okay, in 39, what we see then, where it says Babylon will come, after Babylon will come another king inferior to it. What is the next part of that sentence? Is there a time reference in there? Then what? Then another kingdom. So do this, then another kingdom. Do you like my kingdom? That's my little castles. They're so cute. And what does he say about that kingdom, by the way? Okay, that's right. It will rule over all the earth. Okay, 239. And then we've got the last one. What follows 39 is verse 40. And what is the last part of that statue dream? Then a fourth kingdom. Now, how is it described in the statue dream? legs of iron,
partly iron and clay.
and feet, partly iron, partly clay. That's in 233, right? Correct. Okay, so did anybody, when they were looking at this, get confused that potentially we had 2 more kingdoms here? Okay.
I remember getting confused when we did the first
Okay.
but
But what happens when you come into the interpretation? What does it clarify for you? But what does it say? Then a 4th kingdom, right? And then it goes on to describe that 4th kingdom. How does it describe it? Divided. Okay, let's just put down some of these descriptions. Divided. What else?
well, it'll be tough as iron.
Tough as iron.
Some of it will be strong and some of it will be brittle.
Some strong. Some brittle. We don't totally know what that fully means yet, but what we're seeing is a description of this 4th kingdom, correct? And we definitely at this point know, just by the interpretation of what is given to us, that this kingdom here, where we see the statue, it's a head, it's arms and breast, it's belly and thighs, and it's legs and feet. It's really interesting. The head is the only one that seems to be one item. Everything else, there are 2, belly and thighs, right? Up here was arms and breast. When we get to here, it's legs and feet. So even though there are 2 things that are listed here, legs and feet, but here there were 2 also, belly and thighs. There was also arms and a breast, but they were each a single kingdom, correct? What we know so far, having done Daniel to this point, we know that Nebuchadnezzar, it says, what you are that head of gold. What kingdom followed Nebuchadnezzar? Medo-Persia. Okay, so we see after Babylon is the Medo-Persian, and it comes in its inferior. So what we know is it's Babylon, Medo-Persia. What follows Medo-Persia? Historically, Greece, and then what? Rome. So at least at this point, just by what we know historically, we can begin to already see a timeline of history that's being given to us in these visions and dreams. We see some qualities that are listed that are supposed to give us some insights. This is one of the reasons why it's important to draw out these pictures in the storyboards that she asks us to do. Because what you're doing when you're looking at these things and drawing pictures of them in chapter 7, you're developing your insights about those various kingdoms or the qualities that are given to us concerning them, right? And in chapter 7, a great deal of emphasis is put upon which kingdom. Whereas most of the information that you drew when you drew your pictures from the 4th one. Isn't that interesting? And it happens again here. When you look at these, actually in verse 39, you get 2 kingdoms right there in one verse. It almost brushes over. Up here, same thing. Give you one verse and it just moves on. The next one verse gives you 2 more kingdoms. Then you get to the verse 40, and then there's how much detail given? Lots of detail, just already. And when we go into chapter 7, we're going to see the same thing is going to happen. What does that tell you, just at first blush, concerning your understanding about what we're seeing here in these world kingdoms? Where is the emphasis, and what does that tell you? The 4th kingdom seems to be more important for understanding in detail for some reason. Daniel, I'm telling you something about this 4th kingdom. Let me give you more insight about it. And he did the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar, as a matter of fact. Because after he finished that 4th kingdom, what did he say was the next part of the vision? And I've run out of room here, but what is the next part of that vision of the statue?
Stone.
The stone. And what does that stone do? It does. The stone, what does the stone do to the statue itself? It crushes it and destroys it all completely, right? And then what happens to the stone? It becomes a great mountain. So on my drawing here, I have the stone and I did a great mountain, you see? And it says, and that great mountain does what? It fills the whole earth. So I drew an earth right there to fills the whole earth. So at this point, what do you think that great mountain is depicting? Another kingdom. Now we're going to, I don't remember which homework lesson it'll be, if it'll be next week or the following. At some point, I think Kay takes us though, we do a whole bunch of cross references on mountains and how they're used in scripture in pictorial fashion, what they represent. And so we're going to get into that later. So just hold on and know that we're going to address that on a more broad spectrum. We'll get more information on that. But what we know just from what we're looking at here in our statue dream is we're looking at kingdoms.
So, when you're talking about the stone and would that be? Is that depicting first coming and he's already crushed all of this, and the mountain and everything else has to do with this?
That's a great question, Sharon. What do you think?
A lot of people are trying to figure out what the toes, the mixes, all that, and they're thinking that's future, but on his first coming, I don't know. That's why I'm asking.
Okay, so if you know this, if just in general, if you know this statue represents kingdoms,
Right.
okay? And then the last kingdom to come is going to be this stone that's going to come and crush all these kingdoms, right? And they've all come, but has Rome ever been crushed and destroyed by another kingdom?
Well, they destroyed themselves, just like we are doing.
Yes, but in the statue dream, who destroyed each kingdom? The predecessor to it, right? So we know that Babylon was crushed and destroyed by the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians are crushed and destroyed when Greece comes. Greece was destroyed when Rome came. Who destroyed Rome? But have they been crushed and destroyed by a previous world kingdom, by another world kingdom? No. So if the pattern has been displayed to us that a kingdom will come and crush and destroy it, and we haven't seen that happen yet. Yes, Rome sort of dissipated into right, but it was never crushed or destroyed by another kingdom that became another world kingdom. And since the pattern has been set that another kingdom will crush it and destroy it at some point, what we're seeing right now is that has not happened to Rome. Rome at this point has simply dissipated. So that's all we know right now. And so what you have to do is say, okay, that's all I know right now, but trust me, we're just at the beginning of this. We're going to layer this. When we go now, we're going to look in chapter 7. We're going to layer in some more information. Then we're going to go to 8. We're going to layer in some more. We're going to get into 9 and 10 and 11 and layer more. And then we're going to go to Revelation and begin to layer in yet more. So just know that you've got a couple of years to wait for your total answers on everything. But it's going to start to become really, really evident to you what's going on here as you do your homework little by little. But you have to be patient and let the scripture teach you itself. Because if I just give you the answers, then you're going to say, well, how does she really know that, right? The doubts are still going to be there because you've got plenty of commentaries telling you stuff. Do you believe any of them? Or do you believe them all? And they're all so different. How do you know which one to choose to, believe, right? The best way is to you yourself observe the scripture. And I think the best tool, the very, very best tool of learning the Bible is inductive Bible study. Even though it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of discipline on your part. But if you do every step, if you mark your keywords, if you make your lists, if you do your timelining, if you draw your pictures, little by little, each piece is going to give you more and more answers. And pretty soon it's going to become obvious to you what that answer is to that question. Right now, we don't know yet. And if I just jump in ahead and tell you, I'm giving it to you and you have to trust me. But if you wait, God's going to show you the answer and you're going to go, it was right there all along. I just didn't, I didn't see it, right? That's because why? What kind of literary form are we working with? Prophetic. It's prophecy. Some of it hasn't been fulfilled yet. Some of it has. The parts that have been fulfilled, are they obvious? Yes. The parts that have not yet been fulfilled, that's where we're still scratching our head, right? What part of scripture do we know has not yet been fulfilled? The coming of whose kingdom? God's kingdom. So when that kingdom actually comes, we're going to look at it all and we're going to do like God says in Daniel, in time, you know, as more knowledge comes to you, you're going to have more understanding. But you only gain true knowledge once it's fulfilled, once God shows it, right? Until then, we have to wait on things. But I can tell you that because God has told us the end from the beginning, and when we go right now into chapter 7, you're going to see a lot of your answers are going to be right there. But it's going to get layered even more as you move into 8 and into 9, and 11 is really packed. I mean, it's very complicated, but it's really packed with great insights in 11 and 12. And then when we get to Revelation, you're going to just totally get your Revelation study. You're going to understand how to handle the text, what tools you need to use in order to work your way through it. And it takes time, but you will get there and you're going to come to relax and really enjoy it. Right now, you're still struggling against it because you're not used to using the tools in the toolbox that are for prophecy. Prophecy requires different kinds of observation tools than if you're in the book of Acts or 2 Timothy, right? In chapter 2, okay. In chapter 2, 43, let's read it together. In 42, let's go back up to let's go even to 40 and just read all the way through all that, because it kind of says, then there will be a fourth kingdom. That's where we started here. Then there will be a fourth kingdom. Strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. All these what? All these other previous kingdoms, right? In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay, partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom. Now, when we get into 7, when we look at the beast, that one is going to keep telling us it's different. It's different. It's different. And you need to pay attention to that word different and mark it as a key word, because it's a quality about this kingdom. That's the fourth one, which we now have already said this is Rome. But how is it different? And we're going to have to look at that in chapter 7 and try to pick up on some of the clues that we get there about why is it different? What is the difference that God thinks is significant about it, as opposed to what we might think is different about it? Is it different because it's stronger, because it has more kings in it, because why? So we need to pay attention to that when we get there. So but here it calls it divided kingdom. Okay, and it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. Now we'll have to talk about that more later. What is that talking about? What does it mean, mixed, and some is strong and some is weak? And you know, what is the implication? What is it trying to tell us there? We'll have to try to work that out a little bit more. Then in 42, it says, as the toes of the feet were partly of iron, partly of clay, so some of the kingdom will be strong. There's part of your understanding. And part of it will be brittle. Now, what does that mean? What is something if it's brittle? It's easily broken, right? It'll shatter easily. And in 43, and in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another. How? In the seed of men. But, do you see the but? You want to circle it and highlight it because it's a contrasting term, right? But they will not do what? Adhere to one another. What do you mean adhere to one another? What does that mean? Right? So again, another question. We don't have the answer yet, but there's another question for you. Even as the iron does not combine with pottery. Now it says in verse 44, now we're going to have a little bit of interpretation given to us, right? In 44, it says in the days of what? Those kings. What those kings? Well, go back up to 41. And you saw that the feet of it had what? Toes. How many toes are on the feet? 10. So down in this one, it says, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will do what? He will set up a kingdom in which will never be destroyed, and that the kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put to an end all these kingdoms. Kingdoms of who? Whose kingdoms? Men. The kingdoms of men are going to be crushed and destroyed by whose kingdom? God's kingdom. But it will self-do what? Now, what did God say about all of these kingdoms? What's going to happen to them? Are they going to endure forever? No. But God's kingdom, when it comes, it's going to endure forever. So in this statue dream, the last part was the stone. I'm going to put it up here. The stone, it becomes a great mountain, and it fills the earth.
What verse is that?
It's going to be set up in the days of the feet, right? Of the feet of this statue. In these days right here, this kingdom, which is God's kingdom, it's going to be set up. Now, here's a good question for you, Sharon, concerning the question you had. Has God's kingdom been set up yet? Not on earth. So when he says about this kingdom and about that stone that comes and crushes, do you think that's happened yet? Because when he crushes, what's God going to do? He's going to set up his kingdom. So has he done that yet? Has he crushed Rome yet? No. Not in the depictive form that's given to us here, right? And the standard has been set. See, do not deviate from the standard of the flow of thought. The flow of thought has already been established. First, this kingdom, this kingdom, this kingdom. Each kingdom previous to it crushes each one. When you get to the last one, there's another kingdom that follows it, and it's God's. And it says there's a great stone, and that stone does what to all these kingdoms? Crushes them all, puts it into what kind of kingdoms? Kingdoms of men. At this point, God has not done that yet. So that much we know now. And we know that these feet are a kingdom time when there's feet. Feet have 10 toes, right? And those 10 toes depict what? Kings. In the days of these kings, right? So we now know those 10 toes depict 10 kings. In the days of those kings, God is going to set up his kingdom. Have we had a time when Rome had 10 kings and that God then came in and crushed it and set up his kingdom? Not yet. So it's future, right? We just conclude that it's yet future? Yes. Now, we still have a lot of questions. Lots of things going on in our head going, yeah, but, right? I know we all do that. And I did that too, especially the first couple of times I went through this study. I was still going, oh, I still don't get this, right? Finally, it does start to come into understanding. The more you hang with it, the more you do each step, it layers. That is exactly why precept is called precept upon precept. You learn a little bit, then you learn a little bit more, then you learn a little bit more, and each step layers on top of the one previous to it. So if you skip any of these steps, like drawing your pictures, you're not going to be ready for the next step. Okay, and you're going to miss some things, and you won't have good interpretation. Okay, I think I've convinced you. I hope. Okay, now let's do the next part. So that was chapter 2. That was a vision that was given to Nebuchadnezzar. It was during the days of Nebuchadnezzar, obviously. Now we're all the way down into chapter 7, and the king is who? Belshazzar. So we're in the time of Belshazzar. So sometime at least after 553, that time frame, right? And now let's look at that particular dream and see what we see. It is a vision of what? Vision of, now I love that. 4 beasts. I love the fact that it's already definitive, where with the statue, we had to wait until we got into the interpretation where we saw it's there are 4 somethings, right? But with this dream that's given to Daniel, it starts right off the bat and tells you it's 4 beasts. Now, how are those 4 beasts described to us? Where are the beasts coming up out of, for one thing? Out of the sea. Okay, there's the winds of heaven, right? So if it's winds of heaven, where is this source from? Where's the source of the wind? From God. Okay, now beyond that, we don't really know what that means, but we know that the source of the wind is from heaven. So heaven sends the winds stir up the waters, and what comes up out of the waters? These beasts. Now, what are these waters?
Great sea.
Yeah, the Great Sea. And what is the sea depictive of? Oh, I've forgotten where I marked that verse at. It says that the seas, hold on a second, let me see if I can find it. They come up out of the, hold on. Oh, there it is, verse 17. Go to verse 17. Because in the dream it says there are these 4 beasts and they're coming up out of the sea, right? And that the winds of heaven have blown these waters. So it's the source or the strength of. So what does again that tell us about God? Who's in control of these? Yeah. Again, it really goes back to Daniel 2. God does what? He raises up kingdoms and he puts kingdoms down, right? So again, the source of these kingdoms is God himself. God is raising them up and God is putting them down. We see the winds blowing. We see the seas. We see 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. In the interpretation in verse 7, it says, these great beasts, which are how many? 4 in number, are 4 what? 4 kings who will arise from where? The earth. So now what do you know the sea is depicting? The earth, nations of people, right? Kings and kingdoms, the nations that are rising up. So, interpretations right there in the text for us, which is so awesome. All right, so now we're going to say there are 4 beasts. What is the first beast? Lion with eagle wings. Very interesting. When you go into the details of that, if we're looking at the first kingdom, let's go. And we know there are 4 of them, 4 beasts. These 4 beasts are 4 kings, meaning kings or kingdoms, correct? These 4. Do you see a parallel to the first dream then of Nebuchadnezzar and the statue? How many kingdoms were depicted in Nebuchadnezzar's dream? 4, and which followed with the 5th, which is God's. So 4 kingdoms of men. The first one here is a lion. So who do you think that's depicting? Nebuchadnezzar, right? Okay, how is he described here? He has wings of an eagle. That's the first thing we learned. But then how else does he describe him? And the mind of a human man is given to him. How do you see that explained to us in what we've already learned about Nebuchadnezzar? He did. Would you call that a plucking of his wings? And stood him back up? Gave him, isn't that amazing? So this is, wow, just because we've already done chapter, was that 5? Chapter, I always get these mixed up now. Chapter, well, 2 is the dream of the statue, but Nebuchadnezzar is humbled in 4 or 5. Yeah, okay, 5. Okay, 4. Okay, so he's humbled in chapter 4. So because we've already covered chapter 4 and we saw how God humbled him, we can look at the description that's given to us of this lion, where it says he has his wings. He has wings then that are plucked out. Then we see that he's lifted up and made to stand like a man. How had he been living for those 7 periods of time? Like an animal and like cattle, been grazing on his all fours. So now he's made to stand back up, and a human mind is given to him. So he's restored to his former glory again. So very cool insights on that first one, the lion. So that's the first one. What is the second? And it was resembling a bear. And that's in verse 5. This one was in verse 4. Okay, and description on it. Very interesting. Now, we aren't going to know all of our understanding on this yet. There's going to be more things that have to be given to us. For one thing, how much of the Medo-Persian Empire have we really gotten into? Not much. We got 1 chapter out of it, right? Darius setting up, and we saw Daniel in the lion's den. That's all we've seen so far. So, but we do know that it says it's resembling a bear, and it says that it is raised up on one side. Now, Kay gave us some pictures of that, right? And she said, cut these out and put them on your chart, right? Did you see how that bear was raised up on one side? Now, how might you interpret what that is in its depiction? What do we know about?
Maybe because it's 2 kingdoms, one is bigger than the other or better than the other.
Very good. That's a really good insight, I think, or it's a good possibility. We know that the Medo-Persian, who was stronger of the Medo-Persian Empire? Who became the dominant of the 2? Persia's, right? So apparently raised up on one, it may be the one that's raised up, or the one that's one of the 2. One is stronger and one is more subservient or more dependent on the other, right? The 3 ribs. Yeah. Sharon, what are those? What is that about? Do we know yet? Okay, so what does that tell you that we need to do concerning that information? Wait until we get there. Good girl. You're learning so fast, Sharon. You pick up on this lickety split. It is hard though, and I understand that, but there are some things. Now, here's one thing I do know too about a lot of these visions. There are often little details that are listed in these visions. I never totally know what they might have represented. I can guess, but even like, for instance, when Nebuchadnezzar had the tree dream, and it talked about birds in the air and nesting in the tree, and I mean, I can take a guess, but did the scripture ever interpret that for us and give us understanding of exactly what that meant? Not totally. I mean, there were some clues to it where it says that the whole earth will rely on him and they all come to him to be fed and so forth, because he's literally a dominant world power that is feeding the world at that time, right? So we could maybe make some guesses, but it's never totally told to us. So what does that tell me then if it's not totally addressed? It might not be that important. There may be a message in it, and we can certainly take a stab at what we think it might be. But if scripture doesn't clearly tell us, what should we not do? Interpret something that we have no interpretation for. Now, what we can do, for instance, the 3 ribs in its mouth, let's wait and see if, as we move through the book of Daniel, if we get more insight about it, or if maybe at some point we do some historical research. Maybe that's a yeah, maybe. We know it wasn't 3 kingdoms before it, but they may have been other kingdoms in the region at the time that were vying for that competition to become the world power, and maybe it devoured 3 to become that. It's going to be a little bit like when we go into chapter 7. Remember, there's 10 horns, And then comes up among them a little horn. And what does he do with 3 horns? He subdues them from the roots, from their roots. So we see kings vying for power and positions in these kingdoms. Maybe the 3 ribs have something to do with that. That there was at some point a power play, but we don't know yet. So all we can do is make some wild guesses in our head, maybe jot them down, but lay them aside for right now. And what we do know is it's the second kingdom. We now know by comparing it to chapter 2, it's the kingdom that comes after Babylon, right? Which is, we know, Medo-Persia. And in this depiction, it resembles a bear. And what are the qualities of the bear and why is it different from the lion and all those things? We have to kind of use our imaginations for right now, but we'll wait and see why God uses that. One of the things I did find interesting, though, when you go back and study Babylon, what is its number one visual? Like, it's kind of like America has a bald eagle, right? What was Babylon's sign? It was a lion. Yeah, on everything. Like all their ancient finds that they, rocks and stones and things that the archaeological people, and like when they would find inscription stones, they always had the lion on them. So that was their symbol. And so he uses the lion in the first one. The second one is the bear. Now, why we don't necessarily know yet. Okay, that's the second one. Now the third one, it says now another, right? And how is it described? Like a leopard in number 6. This one's interesting. How many wings does it have? 4. 4 wings of a bird. Why 4? I don't know either. But it is different because if you go back to the lion, he had wings. He had 2 normal wings like most birds would have. Of course, it was a lion with 2 wings. That was kind of weird. But in this case, this one is a leopard and it has 4 wings, right? But it also has 4 of something else, 4 heads, right? And what is given to it is dominion again. And when it speaks about dominion, what is it again saying then? What kind of power is it? It's a world power. Dominion is to have control over or power over basically in maybe not totally the whole world, but what it's saying is it's big enough that it is considered a world power that has influence over the whole world, right? So just like Babylon was a world dominion, the Medo-Persians were a dominion. Now we've got this third one, another one. It's like a leopard, and dominion is given to it, right? Now the next one, and it's called a 4th beast. Again, clarifying there are 4, right? And how is it described? Dreadful, terrifying, extremely strong, right? Iron teeth. But here's the one I like the most of its description. The reason I like it the most is because it's the one that's repeated the most. If you go in and mark it as a key word, you see this word used over and over. What does it say in 7? Go to chapters, Daniel 7, verse 7. Yeah. And he crushes and tramples down the remainder with his feet. And it was different. There's that word different again. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And what? And it had 10 horns. So it's different. And it has 10 horns. Now we've seen the 10 before, right? Over here it says it had these feet. The feet has 10. Over here it says it was a kingdom, a 4th kingdom. It was different from all this. And it says, and the 10 toes, right? are 10 kings, correct? So over here now we have another 10 horns. So just note that we're following a pattern. Each of the kingdoms are being described. What we can do now is parallel them, that there's a sequential order. They're both seeing the same kingdoms, but they're giving us slightly different identifying markers for it, which is really cool, because anytime you see something twice and it's presented to you with slightly different descriptive words, you're getting a broader picture of it. You're getting more insight or additional knowledge about that kingdom. And so by Nebuchadnezzar telling you one quality or attribute concerning these kingdoms, now Daniel is giving you a little bit different insight about it, right? When you look at this, then it goes on after that, it says, and while I was contemplating the horns, then it goes into great details about the horns, the 10 horns, correct? What does it say happens? Then a little horn, yeah, comes up. And what does it do? It subdues and plucks out 3 horns, right? So let's just do the math here. We've got 10 plus 1 is how many? 11. And 11 minus 3 is how many? 8. So we start with 10 kings, right? 10 kings. Then we get 11 kings. Then it goes down to 8 kings. That's going to be important for you to see those numbers, because at some point, all of this mathematical work that you're looking at here, when you get into Revelation, you're going to need to understand it, what they depict, and who they're speaking of, because it's going to help you to then also understand that vision that's given to you when you get into Revelation. Okay, so we had a little horn. He's called a little horn. I just want you to pay attention to that title, the little horn, because later there's going to come up another depiction of a horn, and it's going to have a slightly different name, and we're going to need to be careful to try to distinguish, and we will be able to distinguish them when you look at it more closely, but it's not in today's homework, so it'll come up later. But pay attention to the fact that there's a little horn in chapter 7. Okay, now, what does he tell us when he starts describing this in verses 17 and 18? What do we know about these 4 beasts? What is our interpretation of them? Okay, 4 beasts are 4 kings. Now, anytime the scripture is talking about kings, in the comparison that we're looking at here, we see this head of gold is who? You, Nebuchadnezzar. And who does Nebuchadnezzar represent? Babylon, the king. Now, he wasn't the only king of Babylon, but he is the depict. There's only one head king at a time, right? So speaking of what? So when it says 4 beasts are 4 kings, you could also say 4 beasts are 4 kingdoms, right? 4 kings / kingdoms. I'm adding that in just for clarification, that you understand that there may be, for instance, in each of these kingdoms, there may be additional kings, but there's only one king at a time, right? All right, so 4 kings. And it says, where would they rise up from? Will arise from the earth. So again, we're back to saying these kingdoms that we're speaking of are kingdoms of men. They come from the earth, as opposed to later the stone and that kingdom, which is made how? Without hands, without human hands. And so what do we know about that? If it's not made with human hands, who makes it? God does. So it's a kingdom that's going to be established and made by God. And that's going to be a kingdom that's not of men, not of the earth, but it's of the heavens. And the winds that are stirred up are by God's work, right? And then he goes on in verse 17 where he says, these are the 4 beasts. And then he has a nice big but. And if you didn't notice that, Mark it, circle it, highlight it, because that big but, that's a contrast. Okay, there are going to be 4 beasts. Just telling you, they're coming. There's a lot of information. And that last one, he's a humdinger. He's dreadful. He's terrifying. He's different. He crushes. He destroys. He's ruthless, right? I mean, his description is scary. All the details that you're going to begin to build on this week when you go into your homework next week, you're going to add on to your insights about that. You're going to begin to develop a list of characteristics and qualities about that kingdom and about those kings of that time that are going to help you to identify him when you move into other prophetic utterances concerning him, and you'll recognize him. So this is why it's really important for you to pay close attention to your list making when you're looking at prophecy. Prophecy, what it does, we're going to do the same thing when we go into Revelation in part 2. Part 1 is going to be about the churches, but part 2 begins, it's basically going to be an overview of the whole rest of the book of Revelation. And in that first part, you're going to do all the drawings I told you about. You'll also do a lot of list making. And in that list making, you're going to identify characters. One of the characters we call who? He's a bad guy, the Antichrist. And that Antichrist, once you start noting the qualities and the characteristics of him, also the actions that he takes, the things that he's going to do, and you're going to start paying attention to how is he described, what does he do, what is his character like, right? And also, what's his end, right? That's also a characteristic or a quality about him that's going to identify you for him. So that when you then go to Zechariah, or you go to Ezekiel, or you go to Revelation, or any other passage that has information about that end time king, you're going to recognize him. Okay? So this is going to be an important part of your homework, is learning to look for characteristics and qualities of each of these characters so that later when you see them again, you'll recognize them. Okay? So it's just kind of a heads up for you as to what you're doing here. So now he says these are going to be 4 beasts. They're 4 kings. They're going to rise from the earth, but although they're coming, what else in verse 18? Yeah, the saints of the highest one. They are going to, number 1, receive the kingdom. What kingdom? The last kingdom that is going to be set up by God. That's how long is this one going to last? And what does it tell us right here? Again, we're now seeing another quality or characteristic that's an identifying marker so that we can say, which kingdom are they talking about they're going to possess and control? Well, it's a kingdom that does, how long does it last? Forever. So there's a characteristic that distinguishes it from all the kingdoms that come before it. So you're not going to mistake that the saints are going to inherit one of these kingdoms. They're not. It says they are going to receive a kingdom, and it says that kingdom will be forever. Possess the kingdom forever. Will possess the kingdom forever. Yay! There's my little clock. Forever. Distinguished quality or characteristic about what it is that they're going to be inheriting. Now let's move on. Let's go back and look again at what we see in 23, 24, 27 of that last, because now we're looking at, again, interpretation. We're moving forward on that Daniel 7 dream. We see what went on in the first part. So we're all the way up through 7:18. Now let's look at 23. What did we learn about that 4th kingdom? It's different. There's that word again. It's different from all the others, right? And it's different from the rest. And concerning the feet, what does it say about the feet? In 23.
Tread it down and crush it.
And it says does it say there it's a divided kingdom? Oh, not in that one? Did I get the wrong one?
The 4th beast will be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the others kingdoms, from all the other kingdoms, and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it.
Okay, sorry. I probably pulled it out of one of the other Yeah, somewhere else it said it was divided, and that was an important quality I wanted you to catch on. Maybe it was earlier. Oh man, I can't find it. I know it's in here. Fourth vision, strong law devoured, crushed down, remainder feet, different. Where was it that it said it was a divided kingdom? Does anybody see it? I may have pulled that from the other, yeah, from Daniel 2. I might have made a mistake. I'm sorry. Okay, I think that's what I was my mistake. I think I pulled that out of the Daniel 2. Because I put on here, it was out of verse 23. Obviously, it wasn't, but it was different. And how was it different? I think I must have made the reference back on to myself that it was divided. Okay. When he did say that in the earlier explanation, when he says it's a fourth kingdom and it's divided, that's where we see that in chapter 2. What does it mean that it's divided? We looked at the concept of the feet having iron and clay and that kind of a division and not adhering to one another and so forth. But what could be some other examples of it being a divided kingdom? Okay, maybe different peoples.
It talks about they would mingle, they will combine with the seeds of men, like babies.
Mhm.
That's how
Okay.
they will adhere to each other.
Right. One of the things Sharon brought up was, though, that Rome never really ended. It just sort of it did end in that it dissipated, but
Split in half. It had Rome when it was the downfall. It had a western and an eastern part.
there definitely was that. Okay, there was. And the fact that it kind of dissipated but wasn't destroyed yet, that means, though, it is going to be destroyed, correct? Rome is going to be destroyed by the crushing stone, correct? Mm-hmm. So what does that mean for us about Rome and it being a world dominion? It's not destroyed yet, so what does that tell us about it? Yeah, it has to come back. So could that division, that it being a divided kingdom, also mean maybe there's a lapse in time between the first part of the kingdom and the second part of the kingdom? The first kingdom being that era when Christ came at his first coming, which Sharon brought up. But at that first coming, he didn't crush and destroy Rome. He went to the cross and crushed and destroyed Satan and his dominion over death and sin. But he didn't destroy the Roman Empire. But it did, the Roman Empire dissipated, but it was never crushed and destroyed by another kingdom, certainly not by God's kingdom yet. But yet in our depiction here of our dreams, we're seeing that the stone is going to crush and destroy the Roman Empire, correct? And it crushes and destroys all those kingdoms that are even before it, meaning all world dominions and dominions of men, all kingdoms of men are going to be crushed and destroyed so that God's kingdom will be established. So when it says it's a divided kingdom, could it possibly be speaking about even a time lapse where there was a Rome, it sort of dissipated, but maybe it's going to come back? Have you ever heard about revived Rome? Have you ever heard that phrase, revived? Yeah, it's been around a long time. Well, what does that mean, revived Rome? Well, if Rome never was crushed and destroyed, and it's going to be crushed and destroyed, does that mean for us, as we make interpretation, that possibly Rome is somehow going to come back? And when it comes back, it's talking about the toes of the statue having 10 toes. And when it talks about the beast, it speaks about 10 horns on its head, right? And the horns represent what? Kings. Did Rome ever have 10 kings come together as a coalition of different nations working together cooperatively? No. So that's interesting to think about. So the idea of it being divided and being different are kind of some qualities. I'm just throwing some things out I want you to kind of ponder and think about as possibilities of wealth. And the reason I do this is to say, don't get just locked in on one thought line. Oh, it means this. And you just, that's done. I'm done with that because that's what I think it is. Because you don't know yet, right? What you have to do is factor in, how does God go about crushing and destroying Rome if Rome is not in existence right now? What does that tell you? What about Babylon? We're going to talk about that one a lot later, especially when we get in Daniel. We know that in Revelation, at the end of the age, what happens to Babylon? Vibrant, thriving metropolis of financial and trade and all kinds of things. And what's going to happen to it? It's going to get destroyed, right? There's going to be weeping, and in one day, it's going to be gone. One day, 1 hour, it says. It's going to be an amazing crushing of that place. But is Babylon that yet? At this point, Babylon doesn't even, Babylon is sort of there, but not. They're trying to rebuild it, but does it exist yet? No. Was it ever crushed and destroyed as the Bible describes it? No. So what does it tell us about Babylon? It's going to have to come up, be rebuilt. For instance, another thing, there's not in the way that it's described in Revelation. Okay.
Because you just brought that up, because there was a part that was confusing when we're here in the court of God, and it talks about, the beast and the 3 previous beasts just lose their power, which means they weren't destroyed.
Okay, and for a period of time, there's an extension of life that is extended. The one beast is destroyed, but then the others are given an extended period of time. So what does that mean? They weren't all squished before. So who are those others that are given an extended period of time? Good question. Did you do your drawings? No. Okay. So here's the deal. How did you all do your drawings by chance? No? Okay, not yet. I know. I know. Okay, but you're going to, I know you do. Okay, so here are my pictures here. I'm going to show you what I did. So here's our beast, right? We had them coming up out of the waters. Here's the winds. They're coming up out of the water. Here's our lion who had his wings plucked. We know that's Nebuchadnezzar, and this is probably depicting his being humbled by God. His wings are plucked. His kingdom is taken from him. He's made to have the mind of an animal, but then God will later stand him back on his feet, give him the mind of a man again, and he lifts his eyes to heaven and he praises God, right? So he comes in. So that we know pretty much that's what's being depicted there. The next one, we're not as certain about all of the imagery in there. We know it's a bear, but we know it's Medo-Persia, right? We get to the next one, this leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, which we haven't fully understood all those pictures yet, but we know what kingdom is that. What comes after Medo-Persia? Greece. So we know this is going to be Greece. Then here we have the last one, and we know this kingdom follows Greece is Rome. Okay, so that much we know, and beyond that we're not totally understanding yet, but we know Rome is on the scene. And then we see here 10 horns on his head. A little one comes up in its midst. Can you see that? It's a little tiny, I made it black so that you could be distinguished in color. And then it plucks out 3. So I colored 3 in red, and I gave them roots. Okay? And it says they're plucked out by the roots. Now, what might that possibly mean as far as a king coming along and subduing 3 other kings? Right. Somehow either he merges them into his own power control, or he simply gets rid of them. We're not sure which it means. We just know that they are removed and they no longer have a problem for him. And what you can conclude from that is, what happens to the power of this one horn? He obviously becomes the big cheese on the head, right? And he somehow is stronger and more powerful than all these others. One of the things that we talked about here is that when you have a kingdom, there's only one real king at a time. even in a coalition of 10 kings that come together, eventually ending or landing for us with 8. Where's our plus and minus? I can't remember where we here. Okay, so in the end, it becomes just 8 kings, but we know that a kingdom of leaders of 8, there's one that's greater than the others, and he's kind of leading the others around, right? So he would be called the beast, right? And the beast is going to be destroyed, right? So in my next drawing, it talks about God. He sets up court. My poor God, it talked about his throne. 𝐃𝐚𝐬𝐬𝐲's throne is so much cooler than mine. Hers actually looks like a throne. Mine looks like a wheelchair with the wheels on fire, but it has wheels and they're on fire. So I got that part right. So, your drawings don't have to be great drawings. They just have to depict the right message. So God sits on his throne, and it says the books are opened and the court sits to make judgment, right? So here's my little court. Here's all my little people, and there's the fire. There's the books are open. And it says he judges the beast. So do you see which beast I've drawn on my picture? Which one is drawn here? The black one. The one who subdued the other 3, who probably became the leader of that group, right? Because a kingdom, no matter what the coalition is made up of, there is only going to be one leader at a time. I can guarantee that, right? So if the beast is destroyed, and then what's the next part of that?
As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away. An extension of life was granted to them for an appropriate period of time.
Okay, so dominion is taken away from them. So they're no longer a world power. They have no power, but they're allowed to exist, right? Extension of life is granted to them for a period of time.
Still having trouble with why the little horn is now a whole beast.
Well, because in a coalition, somebody has to rise to the top as the leader.
But if you destroy the whole beast, then all the other little horns.
But it doesn't say that's what happened, because it says the others are given an extension of life. So who is it that gets the extension of life if it's not talking about the other horns?
I'm not seeing that.
Okay, so you go home and draw your pictures and you figure out how you're going to draw that. This is how I did it. I drew it in such a way that the one who has, later you're going to see, as a mouth speaking arrogant words, he comes out against the saints of the highest one. And he's called the little horn, even though he actually becomes the big horn, right? He's the little big horn, the original. So he's the big horn. He's going to be destroyed. When you get Revelation mixed in with this is all going to make sense to you, because you're going to get more pieces of the story about actually sequentially what's happening in history. At what point in history are we? On a timeline of history, where are we when this occurs? What is the next thing that happens? God does what? God does what? Yeah, God's kingdom is set up, because the saints of the highest one receive the kingdom of God. That kingdom is a kingdom that lasts forever. It's God's kingdom, right? That one's not going to be crushed or destroyed. And just prior to this beast up here who we're talking about is going to be destroyed. This beast is one that has a coalition at the point of when he gets destroyed, a coalition of 8. And there's one of them that's the leader of it. And it says one of them gets destroyed, the beast itself gets destroyed. If the major power player of a kingdom is killed, we go in and killed Saddam Hussein, right? Unless you have another king rise up in his place, what happens to the kingdom? It gets basically destroyed. But if it's a coalition of kingdoms, you've got other little kings, in this case, little horns, that are on the head of this big beast that had at one time come together to formulate a beast. But now those other leaders, those other horns are given or granted an extension of time for a period of time.
I just don't see where in the scripture it says, it talks about the horn in the same sentence and the beast. And they're not the same. That's why I'm trying to figure out.
Okay, okay. Draw your pictures out and let's see what you come up with. It'd be very interesting to see. And also what's going to be great is later when you get more insights from other scriptures and you'll see what's actually going on in the timeline. You will get it figured out. I promise you. Okay.
Okay, I almost throw out a question.
Uh-huh.
Why can't because be something separate
Okay.
from the legs and
Okay, because how many kingdoms are there in the statue dream?
but did it say specifically there are 4 kingdoms?
Yes. A fourth beast, right?
Well, it does in the beast,
But on this one it says it's what? A fourth kingdom.
right, but then
Does it ever say there's a fifth kingdom?
well it said hold on, let me check that. Oh no, just give it. And then
Can you answer it, Kristen? Go ahead.
if you look at the word, this is where I got confused last time. So it's because of the words after, then, and then. There's never a transition from one into the other, so it's all the same thing. There's not another after that or then this happens. The next time you have is like in these days, this stone comes out, right? The stone.
Right, the stone comes and crushes it. What we're showing you by doing this is one of the tools of doing a parallel chart. When you did your parallel, hold on, where is my? Here it is. When you did this chart, right here, Sharon, can you look up here for a sec? When you did this chart, did you have 5 or 4 kingdoms?
Well, we have, but it says, and in that you saw this mixing.
So it's adding in another insight about that mixing. And in that you have that mixing. Let me give you some more information about it.
Because my question is, where does the Ottoman Empire fall into
Oh,
all of this?
okay. It doesn't because it's not a world empire in relationship to Israel. And that is where all this information is. One of the things you have to look at when God is giving prophetic utterances concerning world history and the events of it, it's all around his working with Israel as a nation. It started there, but as a matter of fact, when he says in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, he gives King Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, and Israel and the sons of Israel go into captivity to Babylon. And that had all been prophesied through Jeremiah and through Isaiah before. They go into this captivity. And then what happens is every other prophetic utterance that God gives is all related to how he's going to deal with Israel. And as a matter of fact, in chapter 9, if you open your Bible real quick to Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 to 27, and read I think it's in 24. You just have to read the first part. What does it say when you read the whole? Just read that verse 24. Yeah.
70 weeks.
Okay, back up then. It must be in 20.
Beginning of your supplications.
There. Okay.
At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed, so give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. 70 weeks have been decreed.
For who?
For your people.
For you, Daniel, and your people. Your people are and your holy city. So who is Daniel's people? Israel, the Jews. And what is the holy city? Jerusalem. So all of this information in Daniel, he says, this is all those things which are going to relate to my dealing with Israel. As a matter of fact, when you start in Revelation, he starts out with the letters to the churches, but then he stops talking about the churches and they're never mentioned again in the book of Revelation. He goes into the throne room. He lets you know who's on the throne, right? And Jesus is rolling it. Then he starts dealing with Israel again. This is how I'm going to bring about Israel's redemption. And that's what all of these pictorial prophetic utterances are, is how is God going to bring about fulfillment of what he's promised to Israel through Abraham. And what it does is it brings to full picture you go back to Genesis 12 and 13 and what God called Abraham. Where did he call him out of? Or of the Chaldeans. Who are the Chaldeans? Babylon. He came out of the land of the Chaldeans, out of the land of Babylon, called him out, said, I'm going to make you a nation. And he does it supernaturally. He makes promises to him. And then through that promises, he said, and I'm going to allow you, I think it's in 15, he says, for 400 years, you're going to go into captivity. Then I'm going to bring you out. I'm going to give you the land, right? And then he talks about, he says, but one day you're going to sin and I'm going to cast you off the land. And when that happens, then these things are going to happen. One of the things he tells them is through Jeremiah, I'm going to leave you in that captivity with Babylon for 70 years. Then you will come back and rebuild. But they're still underneath whose authority? What's the kingdom that follows Babylon? Medo-Persia. Who allows them to come back and rebuild? Cyrus of the Persian Empire, right? So again, they're no longer, what is the right word? You taught them, what is that word? Where they have their own autonomous, that's it. They no longer have their own control over their own land. They're always under other kingdoms. So all these prophetic utterances are about Israel and how these nations around them are going to affect God fulfilling his promises to Israel. Not really. Not over Israel in the way that these other kingdoms did. And they're not mentioned in the kingdoms that are given to us. We go directly from Greece to Rome as being the ones who are over Israel. The Ottoman Empire is there, but they're not over Israel. Apparently, I mean, that's what God's word tells us. Do you know for sure that they are? We know Ottoman Empire existed, so I'm not arguing with that at all. No, not that I understand. As a matter of fact, it was England for a while. England had control over it. It was, what was his name? Yeah, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, it was a general in the, yeah. So just try not to read more into it. Just look and see what God has told us about world history, what he's told us about world history and how it relates to Israel. And that's what you got to keep as your plumb line of what it is that you're looking at here. When God gives his prophetic utterances, it's concerning Israel and the worlds around them that affect Israel and how God is going to fulfill what he promised to Abraham and to his descendants. And in Daniel 9, he clarifies that to Daniel when he says, Daniel, these things that I'm telling you are about you and your people and your holy city. So all the world history, all these kingdoms that are mentioned that are having an effect are related to Israel and how they affect Israel as a nation. And there are going to be other things happen through history, the stuff happening in the world today, but they don't really have that same effect on Israel that these kingdoms did. And it's all about us just pointing towards God fulfilling what he's promised. And that is, he's going to put Israel back on their land. Are they back on their land? They are back on their land. But are they, but has God established his kingdom yet? No, so that part of the fulfillment has not yet occurred. Has Rome been destroyed by God yet? Crushing of it with that stone. Has that happened yet? No. So it's yet future. Is Babylon going to be destroyed in the future? Yes. Is it in existence as we expect it to be yet? No. What about the temple? There's going to be a temple in the days when Jesus comes back and rules and reigns on the earth. Is there a temple in Jerusalem yet? Are they sacrificing yet? Ezekiel talks about it though, doesn't he? But is it going to happen? But it's not there yet. So what is that? Right.
But so then where do you put in all the different Islamic countries and Islam that want
Good question.
to destroy Israel?
We don't know yet. We haven't gotten that far into our study. And who's to say that maybe they're not a part of those 10 kings that come together as a coalition?
I believe it is a coalition.
I'm with you. I agree with you, but they're not named. So we don't really know them by name yet. We will later get some inklings about who they are when we get into Revelation and do our cross-referencing and additional work. We got 2 years of homework ahead of us. Hang on, baby. We're all going to know when it does happen. When it really starts. Yeah. Yeah. When we get, when we're not at the end time. And we know that when we get into Revelation, we start seeing the breaking of the seals and the trumpets that are sounding and then the pouring out of the bowls of wrath. We're not there yet. We're not in those days. And I pray we are pre-trib people and we will be out of here and we will not actually observe those things happening. Right? We will come back with Jesus when he returns at the end of those 7 years. Yeah. But don't try to bring in more historical information than what's addressed. What's addressed for us is all we're dealing with right now. We see Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And we know God's going to destroy Rome. It's going to be crushed by the stone that becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. Now, we have to iron out all the information on that. What all does that mean? I think the drawing of pictures will be very helpful to you as to, and who are those other, it took me a long time. I had to work on that forever. And quite honestly, I don't think in Daniel alone, you totally get the picture. The only reason I see it the way I see it is because of what I know from Revelation and other cross references that we've done. What I know historically is going to happen sequentially to the Antichrist, when God judges him, when Jesus comes to rule and reign on this earth. Who's present on the earth? Is it devoid of all other countries and nations? No. So there's your extended period of time. And there's some nations that are going to be left, apparently. Right? So I just draw those conclusions from other information that I have dancing in my head. But you have to kind of pull that. But if you just specifically write down what information they do give you, the only information they give you is 10 kings. One king becomes obviously the leader of them, and he's destroyed. But the rest of them are granted an extended period of time. So who's the rest of them? Right? It has to be.
So I guess it's just trying to figure out
Who are they? Well, and it's really going to all be about the logic of it. Who would be the rest of it? Who? The rest of them are granted an extended period of time. The rest of them who? And who's, in the context of what's being said, who's being discussed? The 10 horns. So it has to be the rest of the 10 horns that are being addressed. No, you don't. No, you don't. So you have to draw a conclusion. Who could them be that's granted an extended period of time? You just have to go up by your own logic. It's either related to the other horns or it's related to something that's not mentioned. So which is more logical? Yeah, exactly. You will. You sure will. And that's great. And that is, well, I'm telling you, this is a complex subject. This is why there are so many bad interpretations. This is why you can pick up commentaries and everybody has a different point of view. Even people I love and adore. I mean, some of the great theologians and great teachers, that you go on YouTube and listen to, they all disagree about eschatology on some point or another. Now, we all agree on the big picture, however. We all agree that these kingdoms existed: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. We know that according to this vision, Rome is going to be crushed and destroyed by God, and he's going to then set up his kingdom. Apparently that hasn't happened yet because God's not here and his kingdom is not set up. So Rome at some point is going to have to be on the earth again and be crushed when God comes. And we may or may not ever call it that, but somehow it is going to be, in the eyes of God, Rome. In God's mind, it's Rome. It's the great beast, the terrifying beast at the end that he's going to be dealing with. Okay? So that's all we know, and that's where we work from right now, and we'll just move forward. Next week, you'll have more homework, and you're going to have 2 more weeks in this one chapter. So yeah, you thought you were done? No, this is just the tip of the iceberg. But wasn't it fun? I know it's kind of frustrating too, but it's really fun. It's fun to do this because what you're doing now is you're using inductive tools to say, how can I be objective? Well, objective people look for key repeated words. They make their lists, they do their charts, they look at comparisons. They don't add in anything. Don't add countries or nations that are not listed and start pondering them, because that'll just make you crazy. Look at what does it tell you and work with that. Okay.